Hi, welcome to your first Library Writing 101 study session. This one is called Information Appetizer. I'm Emily. I'm one of your PCC librarians, and my email address is right here on this slide. It's ebessich@pima.edu. If you have any questions, if you have any problems with this video, if you just want to say hi, please email me. So let's get started. Information Appetizer. All of our library content for Writing 101 this year has a food theme. So I hope that you're either hungry or you just ate. Hopefully not feeling nauseous, I guess. Okay, so next slide. So in this recorded version, we're going to be using Play Pause It, and Play Pause It will just be integrated with the video. Some questions will come up and you will answer them. So the first question is going to be, what appetizer is not served at the Cheesecake Factory? So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and fill out that. So just as a review, you've already seen the right answer, but oddly enough, the Cheesecake Factory has a variety of foods, but they do not have cheese fries. They do have cheese tots, but it's not on the appetizer menu, so I still feel pretty good about saying that they don't have cheese fries. So that's how Play Pause It works. Those questions will be integrated throughout the presentation, and once again, just let me know if you have any trouble with any of those. So information appetizer. The reason that we chose an appetizer theme for this particular workshop is that we're going to introduce a few different concepts to you and sort of just kind of get you thinking about some stuff that might come up later in your writing class. So that's why it's an appetizer. You know, it's not a full meal. You're not going to leave today being like, wow, you know, I know a lot of stuff that I can immediately apply. This one's more about just getting you thinking about stuff that is going to come up in your class. So our learning objective for today is to identify issues that you will encounter as you research and write essays in Writing 101. So one nice thing about taking this workshop is that when these things do come up, you'll at least recognize them and feel more prepared than someone who hasn't been thinking about these things at all. That's the goal. So I picked this meme kind of as an introduction. You might have seen it before. So the question, you know, do you want 5 sticks of string cheese? You would be like, no, ew, that's way too much string cheese. But then if you deep fry those string cheeses and give yourself a side of marinara, then you're like, yeah, this is a good appetizer because it's mozzarella sticks. So it's kind of the same idea with information, is that like if we just made a list, say, of everything that you needed to know for Writing 101, you'd be like, wow, this is way too much information. I don't even want to start to learn this stuff. Like, I'm overwhelmed. But, you know, we can kind of mozzarella stick it up, blend it with some other stuff, make it a little bit more appetizing. And once again, that's what we're doing today, is sort of getting you started on learning some of the things so that when it comes time to write your papers, you're not like, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn and so much to do. You're going to be like, yes, I feel ready to write these papers because I've taken these library workshops. That's the goal. Okay, so our first little bite of an appetizer is about scholarly conversation. And you might have heard this term before, so I'm sort of curious, and this will be a Play Pause It question. What is scholarly conversation? So I know that you saw the answers, but I want to go over them. So scholarly conversation, some people could think that it's an elevated type of talking or writing that academics use. And that's something that I get a lot of people saying that they're a little bit anxious about when they're moving on to college. Like either if it's that you're moving straight from high school to college, or maybe, you know, you graduated from high school 10 years ago and now you're coming back to take writing in college. And you might feel like, you know, I know when I write that I don't sound like a dictionary, or I don't sound like a fancy college level book that I'm reading in my class. And that is actually fine. We want you to sound like yourself. You know, we want you to, of course, like practice writing and arguing, but you don't need to use an elevated type of talking or writing that academics use. We want you to sound like yourself. So that's not something to worry about, and that's not the actual definition of scholarly conversation. Then the other one that is not correct but does come up is scholarly conversation could be thought of as a talk between scholars where they try to come up with the correct answer to a problem. So one of the most important things to remember about scholarly conversation is that it's ongoing. So there is never going to be a point where we find the one right answer. It's always going to be different people contributing to the conversation and maybe defining what they think is an answer to a question. So the actual correct answer to this one is scholarly conversation is an ongoing discourse that builds off of other people's work. So once again, it's something that doesn't have a start or an end. It keeps going and you're always building off of the research and work of other people. So actually very fittingly for this workshop, one of the main metaphors to talk about scholarly conversation is the idea of a restaurant. So if you went into a restaurant and sat down at your table and then you heard the people next to you having a conversation, maybe they're talking about the fires in California, and you hear them talking about, here are some of the causes is that, it's getting really dry because there hasn't been a lot of rain. Also, there's a lot of brush buildup because we haven't been clearing out the brush in forests. Maybe you also have some information to add. Maybe you've done research for like a weather and climate class in the past, or maybe you're actually from the California area, so maybe you have some information there. You can add your little bit of information to the conversation. You could be like, hey guys, did you know that in areas where they actually get, rain 3 times a month, they're 30 times less likely to have a fire? I totally made that up. Do not look that up because it's not right. But whatever information that you actually do know and are able to contribute could change the direction of the conversation, right? But you're not going to sit at that restaurant for the next 3 years to hear what other people have to say about the fires. You contribute your little piece, maybe you stay and listen to a little bit more, and then you leave and do something else. And that's the same way that scholarly conversation works, is that researchers do their research, they add their little bit to the conversation, building off of what other people have already done, and then their research interests might change, or they might retire, and then someone else might end up using their information to kind of build the next level, but you don't stay in the conversation the whole time, basically. So one way that I like to think about scholarly conversation, especially the way that we're going to be joining in kind of at PIMA, is that it's kind of like Yelp reviews. So have you guys ever used Yelp or reviewed something on any website? Like Google reviews is fine too. It's the same idea. So if we go to Yelp, let me get out of here. Here we go. So we're going to go to Yelp. And say that I want to find the best nachos in Tucson. I'm going to search nachos. And we have our search results here. So first of all, something to keep in mind is these first 2 results are actually sponsored results. And if you mouse over what that means, it says business owners paid for these ads. So I searched nachos. These reviews actually could mention nachos, at least they are both Mexican restaurants, but they are not ranked based on my search. They basically came up because the business owners paid to have them show up on the Yelp page. And it's actually the same thing on Google. The first few ads you see on Google are often sponsored ads, and you can actually see that the first few results, I should say, that you see on Google are often sponsored, and you can see that on your Google search. So what's funny is that when I was doing this presentation for one of the classes, one of the sponsored results was actually Panera Bread, which doesn't even serve nachos. So these really could be anything. We're just lucky that we got 2 Mexican restaurants in this case. So then after that, here are the actual results. And the first one, Street Taco and Beer Co., we can see that nachos is bolded, Salsa Verde, nachos is bolded, Taqueria El Pueblito, nachos is bolded. So these actually are coming up because they are talking about nachos. But if we do a little bit more investigation, it turns out that the rankings or the way that your results are displayed in Yelp are just the number of times that a word is said. So if we look at Salsa Verde, for example, let's see. So here are the actual reviews. This one, since it is not bolded, doesn't even talk about nachos, but I can actually search within these reviews to just look at nacho reviews. Okay, so this person, August 15th, awesome place with great tasting food. The footling, which must be a typo, right? Foot-long? Football? What does footling mean? Taco is delicious, as are the chicken nachos. So they're saying, okay, yes, chicken nachos good at Salsa Verde. This person, Stacy, said, okay, we ordered chicken nachos. The nachos were drenched in nacho cheese, so by the time they got to us, the chips were soggy. The cheese was okay, gas station nacho cheese. The chicken was okay as well. Nothing special about the flavor, and they definitely didn't put enough on the nachos. So this person, yes, their review was talking about nachos, but if I'm looking to find the best nachos in Tucson, using Yelp to just search for nachos might not work very well because, as you can see, this one was actually kind of a negative review that just mentioned nachos a lot. When I got the nachos, I was confused. Bro, cheese sauce? Really? So they didn't have, shredded cheese on the nacho. It was a nacho cheese sauce. And then another one talking about nacho cheese sauce. So basically, I mean, you can see here that not all of these reviews that you might think would be positive nacho reviews, since this is the number 2 result for searching for nachos, it's actually number 2 just because nachos are mentioned a lot and maybe not always positively. But if we're thinking about this in a scholarly conversation way, you can see that reviews are sort of written the same way. They're written in a way to be useful. And so the times, when someone says, hey, I ordered the street corn, but it was drowning in nacho cheese and full of corn silk, that's helpful because the street corn might sound good on the menu, but this person is saying, it wasn't what I expected. And it also had a lot of the hairy corn silk in it, which was not very appetizing. So when we write reviews, there's sort of a certain format that we follow to make them the most useful for people. So let me go back to my presentation. So if you were writing, say that you actually do know a place that has really good nachos, hopefully you do. How would you write a review to show people hey, these nachos are good and they are worth trying? So I'll give you a minute to think about that. So some potential nacho reviews, you could have a rating system, right? You could say, this nachos, the cheese is 10, chips are 8.5, they're pretty good, not great. Toppings are 9, pretty good toppings. You could say, I give these nachos 4 napkins out of 5. They're snacktastic. What does 4 napkins out of 5 mean? Does that mean that they're messy? Is a napkin good? Is a napkin bad? We don't know from this very short review. The nachos came to the table hot. There were plenty of nachos for the 4 people in my party. The chips were crisp. The cheese was melty. This one is kind of telling a story, right? It's saying the nachos came hot. There were a lot of nachos. Chips were good. Cheese was good. So that one seems pretty useful. Or you could just write nachos were good. So, I mean, while all of these have things about them that are valid, I would say that the one that's kind of telling the story and providing information about the size of the nachos, the content of the nachos, if they were hot or not, is probably the most useful. And I think you guys would agree with that. And when you're reading reviews of anything, it's the same thing, right? Certain reviews are more useful than others. And how do people know how to write a useful review? It's just from reading other reviews. So you guys already kind of know how scholarly conversation, or at least, writing for different types of genres works. It's that you read the stuff and find okay, this is what was most useful to me and conveyed the best information, and then you write in that style. So that's basically what I mean when I'm talking about scholarly conversation, is just that the sources are in a conversation, and depending on what discipline you're researching in, say that you're taking Psych 101 and so you're looking at psych papers, or say you're a nurse and you're looking at nursing papers, they have a certain style of writing. They have a certain way that they format their papers, different sections where different information always goes, and it makes it really easy to read and understand, hey, I'm looking to see what type of research method this study used to look at mental illness. Then to go right to the method section of the paper, and it's right there. So scholarly conversation is basically just the idea that sources are in conversation, and the way that we structure our information makes it easy to sort of pick up on the threads of that conversation. And part of scholarly conversation that's really cool for you guys in college is that you're part of this. You are a producer of information, just like in the restaurant example where you sit at your table and then you add something to the conversation. That's your role as a researcher. So even in Writing 101, when you're writing papers maybe about a controversial issue, or you're writing a letter to your Congress person asking them, to make a change, you are an expert in that area and you're sharing your knowledge with everyone else. And that's super, super cool. So basically, think of scholarly conversation as just, the ongoing talk that scholars or information producers in an area have. So how do we know then in this talk what information comes from you versus what information comes from other people? How do I show, this is my personal expertise versus I read this somewhere and I want to add it to my paper? the way that we show that is citations, right? So if you look at the end of a paper that's a published scholarly article, you can always see the list of their sources. And the list itself, just kind of looks like a bunch of names organized alphabetically. But if you made it into a diagram, which is kind of what I've done here, well, not what I've done, what I found here for you, you can see that really it's showing like the web of information and how those are all connected. So say that you cited a paper that was written by this person. So this is the citation that you have in your paper. This person, in order to write their paper, actually read and cited this person, they read and cited this person, this person, this person, this person. And then, of course, like this person that they cited all of these people around them. So the idea is basically that even if you maybe read 4 things and cite those 4 in your paper, you're building off of dozens, if not, double dozens, 24 or more sources. So it's a really cool idea just that you can do just the amount of research that you need for your paper. Don't feel like I need to be a complete expert in my field in order to contribute something. I mean, it's the same thing, like you don't need to eat every nacho in Tucson to be like, this place has good nachos. I trust your ability to evaluate nachos. Same thing, I trust your ability to write and use sources. But what's cool is that your sources that you use are actually built off of all of these other sources too. So that's kind of the idea, and this is a depiction, I guess, of what the scholarly conversation looks like. Okay, so that's our first bite. Now we're going to move on to creating and using information. So once again, back to citations, they are a representation of the scholarly conversation, right? So you have the list of who you cited at the end of your paper, and that shows what sources you used for research in your paper. And we also use the in-text citations. Those are the ones that are in the parentheses, and those show immediately, this idea or this quote didn't come from me, it came from this source. And then your teacher or whoever's reading your paper can flip to the back of your paper and see like, okay, so this says Smith, and I can see the Smith citation here, and if they want, they can even read that paper and learn more if they want to. So citations are a representation of the scholarly conversation. They show that we've done our research, right? So they provide both logos and ethos to our papers because logically, we're showing that we have like facts and data to support the things that we're saying. And then ethically or, trusting the speaker wise, it's showing that I have put in the time to actually research this topic, so I do know what I'm talking about. So they kind of have 2 different functions there. And then, of course, they're also required for papers. So you will have papers that say you need to cite at least 3 sources, and 2 of those need to be scholarly sources from the library. And we will talk more about like what a scholarly source means and how to find them in our next session. But basically, a scholarly source is one of the ones that is participating in that scholarly conversation, and it's generally published in an academic journal. And then the third reason, of course, that we need citations is that they help you avoid plagiarism. So I'm assuming you guys have talked a little bit about plagiarism before in previous classes or maybe already in your writing class, but how would you define plagiarism? So my quick definition of plagiarism would be passing off someone else's work as your own. And the reason that I used work instead of writing or words is that you can actually plagiarize many more things than just writing. Like we think about writing because these are writing classes, but if I took someone's code that they wrote in a computer class and then I posted that on my website and said that I made it, I'm plagiarizing that person's code. If I take a drawing or an image that someone else created and don't credit them, that is plagiarism. Even like on Twitter, Instagram, where you see people reposting maybe a joke or an image that someone else created and then removing their screen name from the post, that's plagiarism. They're implying that they created that content when really they didn't. It was whoever originally posted it. So plagiarism is more than just words, but it is always kind of, a form of stealing or kind of a form of dishonesty in terms of using other people's information. And you see it in music all the time too, right? Like sometimes different artists will get in trouble for sampling a piece of a song that they didn't have the rights to sample, or they'll say, no, I came up with it by myself, but it ends up being really similar to an existing song, and then millions of dollars change hands trying to figure this out. And sometimes the original artist who did create that sample ends up getting a lot of the money from the new artist who ended up sampling them. So it's a really big deal in academics, of course, but it's also a big deal just in the real world. So another definition, though, of plagiarism that's important to keep in mind for college is that not reusing your own work is also part of avoiding plagiarism. So what I'm saying is, say that I wrote a paper for psychology that was about human development, and I talked specifically about preschoolers. And then I have another class, let's say like a sociology class where we're talking about education, and I'm like, oh yeah, I already wrote this paper about preschoolers. I'm going to use that in this class. No, you can't do it. You cannot reuse your work. That is considered self-plagiarism. And the idea is basically that, the purpose of an assignment is for you to apply what you're learning in the class you're taking now, do some research, combine it with your own ideas, and then create something new. So if you're just regurgitating something that you learned in a previous class, you're not fulfilling the purpose of the assignment. You're not learning something new. You're not applying what you're learning in your new sociology class. So we don't allow you to reuse work. And also something to keep in mind is that if something has been turned in before, often turnitin.com, which is one of the websites that we use to check for plagiarism, will show like, yes, Emily turned in the same paper 2 years ago. So that's another thing, is that like sometimes you'll get caught just because your teacher will be like, hey, this barely fits into the prompt that I wrote for this class, but it could also be that, hey, turnitin.com showed me that your paper is 99% the same as one that you turned in last semester or whatever time it was. And one thing to keep in mind with plagiarism, we talked about like the money changing hands if it's like a music issue, but in terms of academic integrity, it is something that is a hot button issue for instructors, because it can be really frustrating when you have a student who didn't put in the time to actually write their own paper or share their own ideas, and instead they're just using someone else's. It is annoying. It's insulting. It feels like that your teacher is putting in so much effort to teach you, and then you're not putting the effort back in to show that you're learning, basically. So kind of can make people mad, as well as being against the rules and just a kind of uncool thing to do. So copyright is something else I want to talk about, just because sometimes people think like, oh my gosh, if I plagiarize, I could be arrested. No, plagiarism, we're thinking about it more in the academic context, and it's more of a learning opportunity. If you do get in trouble for plagiarism, we're not going to sue you. We're not going to have someone lock you up. It's going to be, hopefully an opportunity to redo the work or rewrite the assignment, but probably you will not get any points. You'll get a 0 for that assignment. So copyright, on the other hand, is a legal concept, and it's the idea of giving a creator credit for their work. So that's something that's always good to do. If I, all of the images that I used in this presentation, I put a link to where I found them. That's not a full MLA citation, but it is showing, hey, this is not my own image. I actually found it here. That's a good way to give someone credit. That's not really a copyright issue, because since it's for education, you kind of have more freedom in terms of copyright, but it is just a good thing to do. And I would say get into the practice, like when you're writing discussion posts, when you're turning in papers, of just showing where you got your information, even if the particular assignment does not require citations. You could still say, image from here, or quote from this website, whatever it is. But yeah, so copyright can be related to plagiarism, but it is a separate concept that's more about just giving a creator credit for their work. If I, in this class, showed a clip from the movie Coco, you would know, like, Emily didn't write or create or animate Coco, right? It's like from the Disney company. But if I don't give Disney credit for their work, it's not like you're going to think that I made it, but it still would be a copyright violation. Okay, so then our last little bite, we're going to talk a bit more about research and sources. So back to Yelp. So we're back on Yelp. We're looking at Salsa Verde again. Let me go back to our original nacho source, or an original nacho search. Wow. Here it was still on Salsa Verde. Okay, so some other things I want to talk about in terms of how Yelp kind of works, and in general how the internet works, is that any of these any of these search results they could really be ranked on how many times nachos are mentioned, but I believe, and we'd have to look up how Yelp actually functions to know this for sure, that it is also ranked on places that are near me and also places that I have been before and like to go. So I actually live on the west side of town over here, and as you'll notice, a lot of these restaurants are kind of near me. They're only one of them, the sponsored Toro Loco, but also Salsa Verde, are far away from where I live. The rest of them are kind of in a pretty short driving distance from my house. So I think that's a little suspect, and also Street Taco and Beer Co. is one of my favorite restaurants. They catered my wedding and they also came up as #1. So does that mean that Street Taco and Beer Co. has great nachos? Yes, they do. But it could also be that, Yelp already knows Emily likes Street Taco. So they privileged that search result higher on the result list. So when you're searching anything online, using Google, using Yelp, using whatever search engine you prefer, generally the results are not neutral. They are ordered in certain ways. Sometimes there are sponsored results like we have here. Sometimes they are based on keyword hits, which may not be the best way to look at results based on what you're searching. If you're searching online, your results are always going to have some sort of bias or some sort of slant. If you're searching on the library databases, we know exactly how those work, and generally the results will be kind of less biased or less slanted because we're going for, just like the straight up academic information. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you are searching Google Scholar, it's kind of the same thing where at least it's filtering out all of the not scholarly, just online information, but your results still may be ordered. They're ordered according to the Google algorithm, which, is not 100% transparent, I would say. So another thing to keep in mind, I don't know if we'll be able to find one right here, but let's look at Taqueria El Pueblito, which is a very good restaurant if you'd ever been there. So on these reviews, let's look at one. Let's sort by, this is another cool thing, is that, see, these are sorted by Yelp sort. So they're not sorted by time. They're not sorted by rating. They're not sorted by elites or like people who reviewed a lot of stuff. They're sorted by Yelp sort. And so Yelp sort is Yelp's own specific algorithm for sorting results. So that's another great example where all websites have a certain algorithm that they want to show you. Even when you're like shopping for clothes, the stuff that comes up on the page is going to be based on what the company thinks you're most likely to buy, right? So let's say I want to search for lowest rated reviews of Taqueria El Pueblito. 1 star from 2020. COVID-19 updates. So they are only open for takeout and delivery, and that's okay. However, the quality of the takeout is substandard. I really like this place, but they are currently just throwing things in a box and giving it to you outside. No flavor, no consistency, tasteless. Okay. That one, is a negative review. He says that he does like this restaurant. He's written a lot of reviews, 151. So we can trust that, this is probably true, that maybe, especially at early COVID, they were having trouble sort of adopting to the just takeout only model. Let me find another one. I always like, and I'm sure that you guys have seen this before, but I like to find the ones where someone hasn't reviewed very many places. So this one's good. William H., he's only reviewed 10 places ever. Worst El Pastor tacos I've ever had. They were cold, and you could tell they just pulled it out of the fridge recently. The salsa bar is questionable. So that's a great example of kind of more of a biased review, right? Well, maybe not even biased, but it's just like it's a very negative review. He doesn't review things frequently, and he didn't like what he got. So I have some other examples that I've created of more biased reviews that we'll kind of move into away from Yelp. So which of these reviews would you say shows bias? I'm going to read them out loud even though you just voted, but one could be, I couldn't even eat my food because the waiter who brought it out was so ugly, I never wanted to eat again. So that one, obviously the person is biased against the way the waiter looks. They said the waiter put them off their appetite. I would say that review is not really about the food. It's not even really about like the atmosphere of the restaurant in terms of like cleanliness or, it was romantic or whatever. It's saying like this person was really ugly. So that seems like a really biased review to me. The food was all right, but the owners of this place support elephant hunting. Never go here. So you might see this type of review too, right? Where it's like the whatever this restaurant is known for, like their food is fine, but the people who own it are questionable, and that's why you shouldn't go here. So that's showing bias against the people who own the restaurant. And it could be, very valid to boycott that restaurant, but it is still a form of bias. This was the best spaghetti that I've ever had, but I hate Italian food, so I'm giving this place 3 stars. So this one's a little bit confusing, but they don't like Italian food despite having eaten at an Italian restaurant. And even though the spaghetti was very good, because they're biased against Italian food, they're giving it a lower grade. And the last one, I've been going here for my birthday since I was 3. Their sopapillas are the best in the world. So this sounds like a really positive review, right? Like I've been going here every year. They have some of the best sopapillas in the world, but that still is biased because if it's a restaurant that you traditionally go to and you think that one of their food items is the best in the world, have you had sopapillas from any other restaurant? Does this restaurant actually have really good food, or does it just have really good memories because you've been going there so long? Even though it's a positive review, it still shows a little bit of bias. So yeah, it was a trick question. All of these reviews in their different ways show bias. And it's just an important thing to remember is that bias is not always a negative thing. So a lot of these ones that we read were negative, but the one about the sopapillas was a positive review, but it still is showing a different type of bias. So one thing to keep in mind with bias is that everyone has their own experiences, thoughts, and biases. So bias can kind of sound like a really negative word, right? Like, hey, you're being biased, but it's part of life. We all have our own biases, and the important thing to keep in mind is that we just have to be aware that those things exist, and then we can kind of counteract them. So biases can influence what you choose to write about, right? So it could be like if you're writing in your class about a problem in your community, you might not see something as a problem that a classmate is like, no, this affects me every day. It's a huge problem. So that's a form of bias. And of course, you could change your mind and be like, wow, after reading Maria's paper, I really understand that, this really is an issue and that we need to have, let's say that Maria says the issue is that some neighborhoods don't have access to fresh foods within walking distance. So maybe within walking distance, there's like a 7-Eleven, there might be like a taco shop, but you can't get like fresh fruits and vegetables within walking distance. That's kind of how it is in my neighborhood. That is an issue, right? And so what could we do to, or maybe you say that's not a big deal at all because you could just order groceries online and have them delivered. So sure, maybe you don't have a car and you can't walk to get fresh groceries, but just do an online delivery. But then, maybe some people don't have consistent internet access, or maybe they're not home all the time, so they don't have, their hours don't match up with when grocery deliveries match up with, or, there's tons of other reasons why that could be an issue. But sometimes just what we see as a problem is influenced by our own biases. And once again, that's fine, and we can always change our mind, but it's something to keep in mind. And it also impacts what information you use in your papers. So kind of what you think counts as evidence. So if I write a paper and I'm trying to convince people to agree with me that cats are the best pet of all time, then I'm going to use a lot of sources that say, cats are great, cats keep you healthy, cats are much cleaner than dogs, cats are cute, etc. And I'm not going to use information that says cats murder their owners at night, or, cats have rabies, or like whatever other stuff. So, of course, we encourage people to kind of look at both sides of an issue, but bias does impact what you count as good information, basically. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. And what you learn about in Writing 101 when we're learning about constructing arguments is kind of how to confront bias, or how to convince someone that you really have done your research and you have kind of looked at the issue from all different sorts of angles, basically. So that's something that we'll practice throughout these workshops and in your Writing 101 class, is how do we write without bias, or once again, you can't be completely free of bias because you're a human being, but how do we confront our own biases in our writing? So if we're thinking more specifically away from Yelp reviews, but toward what we might actually write about in class, which source may contain biased information? So we have a newspaper article, an academic paper, a website, or a YouTube video. So a lot of people pick a website or a YouTube video, which makes sense, but this was actually a trick question. any of these could be biased. So if you think of a newspaper article, generally the mission of a newspaper is to inform people neutrally with news. But newspapers have opinion sections where people are writing arguments to try to get you to agree with them. So if you pick something from an opinion section, and sometimes it's not always obvious that something's an opinion, that could show bias. And then sometimes different news outlets, I'm sure that you've seen this before, kind of have different political alignments. And so something might be presented a little bit more biased, or they might be using different evidence, like we talked about before, to sort of get their political agenda across. So newspaper articles, we hope, are neutral, and often they are, but sometimes they can be a little bit biased. An academic paper. So academic papers, much like how I was saying earlier, the library website's pretty trustworthy, especially if you're searching for academic papers. The goal of an academic paper is to be unbiased. It's to just present information, add evidence to this conversation, show people what I know, basically. But once again, what you think counts as evidence comes into play here. So I was thinking about the COVID vaccine is a great example, where there's millions, if not probably billions of dollars on the line for the company that creates the most successful COVID vaccine. So if they're doing an academic study that's looking at which vaccines are the most effective, and they specifically pick people who had good outcomes, they didn't get sick after getting this vaccine, and they don't look at the people who got the vaccine and then still got sick, or got the vaccine and had side effects that were really awful just related to the vaccine, and then they publish that saying, our vaccine is super good, look at these awesome results. That is showing bias, of course, right? They're trying to leave out certain data to show that their particular vaccine is good. And that would be an unethical practice. We don't often assume that academic papers have that type of bias in them, but it's something that could happen. And then what usually happens after that is that scientists read those papers and they say, hey, wait a second, you said that this vaccine was 99% effective, but other studies have shown that the vaccine is really only 68% effective, and it looks like you forgot to look at, women from the ages of 35 to 45, and those people had really bad reactions to your vaccine. So oftentimes, like, the lying or dishonesty is caught in academic papers because they're read and they're part of the conversation. But it could happen that something is published that is biased, and then it'll have to be retracted. So that means that we actually remove it from the body of knowledge and say this one actually doesn't count as an academic paper anymore because we found out that the person was lying. A website obviously could be biased because you can publish whatever you want online. Even official websites that are, like .orgs sometimes contain biased information. And then a YouTube video, of course, also could be biased. It could be great. Some YouTube videos are awesome. Some of them are really trustworthy to use, but some of them are not, of course. Okay, so that's kind of it for today. We talked about the scholarly conversation, which you will be participating in. We talked about citations and about kind of how we conduct this conversation, and we talked about avoiding plagiarism, which is part of it, and then we talked about bias and how we all have bias. It's fine to have bias. Don't think like my goal is to get rid of all bias, because that's not possible, but our goal is to sort of confront the biases that we have and figure out how we can write to show that we have really looked at other people's ideas and opinions. So for our next workshop, we'll be talking about successful researching. So we're going to be moving on from these big ideas to actually how do we apply these in the library databases. And this should hopefully pop up on Play Pause It, but I do have a Google form for you to fill out to show that you watched and attended this workshop. I will then share that information with your instructor. And if the Play Pause It does not work, then we will figure out a second way. I'll just have you email me, and my email will pop up at the end of this, so no worries there. And thank you very much for attending. So once again, I'm Emily, this first person. This is my contact info. My colleagues Monique and Teresa will be giving they'll be giving some of the other library study session presentations, so you'll get to know all of us this semester. And please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. So thank you very much. Have a great day. Don't forget to fill out your workshop attendance and evaluation form so that we know that you attended and we can let your teacher know. Bye.